Hello and welcome to this edition of Middle East Matters, which concentrates on Syria. 4 years after the uprising there began, 4 years, over 200,000 people killed, 10 million forced to flee their homes, as many more hiding in bombed-out cities and in desperate need of help. We're going to look at the lives that have been shattered and how the war can be brought to a close. It started as a popular uprising. It started with a protest calling for freedom. It started with graffiti on a school wall. And it led to a brutal civil war that rumbles on. Shirley Sidbon looks back at where it all started and what's changed.
Freedom in Syria. Protesters chanted the words over and over again. These demonstrations against the Syrian regime were the first in many in the lead-up to the war. For weeks, protests had been staged in other Arab countries as the so-called Arab Spring had begun, and these Syrians hoped that they too could have more democracy. But authorities cracked down on the movement, and 6 months later, the opposition created its own armed wing, the Free Syrian Army. In July 2012, they launched the Battle of Damascus, which they never managed to capture, then the Battle of Aleppo, Syria's most prosperous city at the time. The opposition to control the east, the regime of the west, while civilians fled the bombings. That same year, in August, 1,429 people were killed in violent clashes outside Damascus. The regime was accused of attacking its own people with deadly gas. Bashar al-Assad denied, but following the allegations, the UN Security Council voted its first resolution, forcing the Syrian authorities to destroy their gas arsenal. In 2014, a new jihadist group created in Iraq, the self-proclaimed ISIS, emerged, brutally confronting the regime and opposition. It seized rebel-held territories and then regions in neighboring Iraq, killing thousands of innocent civilians and proclaiming its own country, which it called the Islamic State. The organization launched a parallel war on social networks. Trying to terrorize the West, they decapitated several journalists, posting the assassination videos online. As the Islamic State group advanced, the U.S. decided to help push it back. It formed a coalition that launched airstrikes against militant positions. After weeks of fighting, Kurdish forces pushed the jihadists out of several areas like Kobane, near Turkey. 4 years of war have devastated Syria. More than 200,000 of its people have been killed, millions have fled. Ancient sites are ruined, the infrastructure and economy are shattered. These satellite images show the level of destruction. 83% of Syria's nightlights have disappeared. In many areas, even those who still have electricity are too afraid to turn on the switch.
Last week, US Secretary of State John Kerry said that negotiating with Bashar al-Assad would have to happen in the end, an idea that outraged many nations who continue to insist that the president must go. Assad, for his part, dismissed the words as just hot air. Rochelle Harrison-Pless looks at the position he finds himself in today.
Washington willing to negotiate with Bashar al-Assad, but the Syrian leader says talks on his future were for the Syrian people only.
Any declarations coming from outside Syrian borders are just words that vanish eventually, so it doesn't matter if they say that the president stays or goes. What matters is reality.
Moves to bring an end to the Syrian war have so far played into Assad's hands. Negotiations to reach a political deal are deadlocked. The Geneva peace talks in 2012 and 2014 both ended in failure. 2 special envoys have thrown in the towel, and a third is trying in vain to achieve a temporary truce in Aleppo. Meanwhile, the Syrian opposition is racked by infighting, its political leaders in exile and far from the front line. They aren't recognized by rebels fighting on the ground.
Right now, Bashar al-Assad doesn't feel he has any competition. He doesn't need to come to the negotiating table in good faith because he's winning militarily and there's no political competition.
No political competition, plus the unfailing support of Iran and Russia. Moscow had no qualms about vetoing a UN resolution that condemned the Syrian regime. But according to some observers, inaction of the international community is to blame for Assad's grip on power.
The problem of the diplomacy about what it wants from Syria, and I think this has been the problem of the U.S. administration from the time they decided not to allow the opposition to take sophisticated weapons and anti-air weapons that could have changed the balance of power a long time ago.
The White House has stressed that negotiations that include Assad is not an invitation to direct dialogue. A fresh round of talks is set to take place in Moscow next April, but key opposition groups could once again snub the meeting.
Well, joining us now in studio is Franco-Syrian journalist Hala Kudmani. Hala, thanks for coming into us in studio. Now, you're just back from a trip to Aleppo. Tell us, what did you find? What's left?
I, of course, went to the rebel part of Aleppo, which is absolutely devastated. I mean, there is not a single building standing. You see destruction everywhere. Especially, you feel it with the silence all around.
How are the people surviving? There's still something like 400,000 people in Aleppo.
I went into one neighborhood of Aleppo, which was completely destroyed. And in one street, I found 3 families remaining there just because they really can't afford to move. It's really a day-by-day survival.
Now, you mentioned, Hannah, that you were in the rebel-held part of Aleppo, but give us an idea of who controls what, because there's even a number of rebel groups at this stage.
Aleppo is divided into almost 2 halves. One, the western part controlled by the Assad regime forces, and the other rebel-held part, which is mostly the east and south of the city. But inside the town, things are almost organized. The rebel groups, there's a coalition of rebel groups now called Jabha Shamia, holding this part of Aleppo. They are not really coming into the everyday life, so they control some areas, some checkpoints inside town, but I think they have started to learn the lessons of the past, not really bothering the population.
Now, over the last few months, certainly in the West, we focused more and more on the role the Islamic State group is playing in Syria rather than on the population. What do you think of these coalition-led airstrikes? How are they going to leave the Syrian people? Will it eventually help them in the long run, or is it leading to more fear today?
In Aleppo, where the Islamic State was there for some time, and then had a fight with the local rebel forces and was pushed away at the beginning of 2014. The Syrian population really rejects the Islamic State, and the raids of the coalition are not really, I mean, they are quite well targeted and not hurting the Syrian population, although there have been some collateral damages, as we see.
Bashar al-Assad, he has held on to power over the last few years, and increasingly he looks somewhat in a stronger position.
Well, actually, he's not at all. It's just like he's now on a media campaign trying to regain some credibility, especially in the West, and trying to appear as the civilized person versus the savage terrorist Islamic State. But actually on the ground, his forces are not gaining at all.
Well, thanks so much for coming in to talk with us in studio. Hala Kudmani there, a Franco-Syrian journalist who's just back from Aleppo. Aleppo, as we've seen, a skeleton city, its population reduced to under 1/5 of what it was before the war. In total, some 10 million people have been displaced, many of whom have crossed the border. Our reporters met 2 refugees, one a teenager living rough in Lebanon, the other a middle-aged man who has opened a popular restaurant in Istanbul.
صار لي بلبنان شهر سنة شهر عايش لوحدي قالي والله ما بعرف ماتوا طابوا بسوريا والله ما بعرف اجي داعش لعنا عالجرية عرفوني ابعد عنهم لانه بيضربون الطيران ابعد عنهم قام بيي تاني نهار الصبح جابني لهون والله بنجاري بالصب اعترفت على واحد هون 7 جبالة وعمرو معه ليك كده أغراضي هون أغراضي اليوم رحت 4 الصبح حليت مثل هيك أعطاني 10,000 100,000 بفضل ضل هون مشان ما بروح بموت.
I was living in a small town. Its name is Zabadani, near Damascus. The situation that time in Syria was so like a volcano. It's moving inside the problems. When I leave Damascus, I start to bring my whole family. It take about 1 year. I don't have any feeling now to Syria because not my Syria. I have no hope for Syria. I see the future is black. I see the future is finished because the game is so big now and all people want to win.
Well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Middle East Matters. Do take care and see you again next time.